Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Charting a new course, restructuring state-owned enterprises. This is what we'll be discussing in today's expert panel discussion organized by Central Bank Studies of Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Central Bank Studies, or rather we call as CBS, is a human capital development arm of Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Apart from conducting capacity development programs, CBS is also engaged in hosting various public forums to facilitate awareness and discussions on timely topics. And today's expert panel discussion is another extension on such efforts. Now, this topic, restructuring SOEs, it has created a lot of discussions and debates among many. So today, we expect to contribute this discussion in a healthy way so we can understand different aspects on the subject matter. Having said that, let me have the pleasure of welcoming all of you who are joining with our expert panel today via Zoom and also via Facebook page of Central Bank. It's a quite good crowd we have here today. So thank you very much for appearing. And in terms of today's webinar, for delivering the keynote address of this expert panel discussion, we have invited Mr. Suresh Shah, Head of SOE Restructuring Unit of Government of Sri Lanka. Mr. Suresh Shah is a fellow member of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Sri Lanka. He's a past chairman and of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce and of the Employers Federation of Ceylon. Previously, he has served as a commissioner of the Securities and Exchange Commission of Sri Lanka and a member of Council of University of Moratuwa and a member of the Monetary Policy Consultative Committee of Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Apart from that, he served as the Chief Executive Officer and board member of a public listed company for 30 years prior to retirement. He currently sits as an independent non-executive director on a number of listed and private sector entities while serving as chairman in 2 of those. As I mentioned earlier, he also heads the SOE reform unit of the Government of Sri Lanka right now. We warmly welcome you to this session, sir. Subsequent to the keynote speech, which will be delivered by Mr. Suresh, we will commence our discussion with the participation of our esteemed panelists. Let me very briefly introduce them and welcome all of them to this forum today. We have Mr. Manjula Silva, former Secretary General and CEO of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. And prior to holding that position, he served as the chairman of the state-owned insurance, National Insurance Trust Fund, and served as a commission member of the Securities and Exchange Commission of Sri Lanka. Prior to 2015, he has also held many leadership positions in both public and private sector entities, including the post of Director General, Public Enterprise Reform Commission. Then we have Professor Rohan Samarjiva, Chairperson of Learn Asia, an ICT policy and regulation think tank active across emerging Asia. Professor Samarjiva has held senior positions in various organizations, including the chair of the ICT agency, the apex body for information and communication technology within the Government of Sri Lanka in the period 2018 to 2019. He was the team leader at the Sri Lanka Ministry of Economic Reform, Science and Technology from 2002 to 2004 and responsible for the infrastructure reforms, including participation in the design of the USD 83 million East Sri Lanka initiative. Professor Samarjiva was also the Director General of Telecommunications in Sri Lanka in late 1990s. And this panel discussion will be moderated by Mr. Danath Fernando, the Chief Executive Officer of Advocata Institute, an economic policy think tank in Sri Lanka. And Danath has been very vocal on various reforms to be brought forward in the recent past. So we warmly welcome all of you with great honor, sir. So as I mentioned earlier, today we have a good viewership joining with us via both Facebook and Zoom virtually. So our viewers can interact with the session and direct your questions to the panel in 2 ways. First, you can submit the questions via Q&A option in Zoom, or if you are joining via Facebook, you can post a comment to the Facebook live stream so we can pick your questions from there. And towards the latter part of the session, we'll be sharing a link with you to obtain the feedback from the event. Please be kind enough to fill that as well so we can further improve. So without taking much time, let me I have the pleasure of inviting Mr. Suresh Shah to commence the keynote speech. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you to the Central Bank for inviting me to speak a few words at this session. When you introduced me, you said that SOE restructuring causes a lot of excitement. Frankly, I don't know why it does that. It shouldn't really. But I think the reason why SOE restructuring causes so much excitement is because when people think about SOE restructuring, the immediate reaction is that it's all about privatizing. Unfortunately, SOE restructuring goes much beyond privatizing. And the real objective of the restructuring process is to provide improved products and services to consumers. And to do that through a much more competitive economic framework than what is there at any given time. So this is the fundamental reason why we need to look at SOE restructuring, to improve products and services to consumers through a more competitive economy. What do we mean when we say improve products and services to consumers? It's about giving them better quality products and services. It's about providing citizens with products and services at better prices. And it's about providing citizens with those products and services at the right time and at the right place. So this is what SOE restructuring is all about. And yes, of course, in this process, there will be some institutions that will be privatized, and there will be some institutions that will remain within government. Now, the fundamental question really is, how do we make this call as to whether certain institutions will remain within government, or would they be better, would the consumers be better if these enterprises are actually put into private hands? Or I like to use the term unchained from government control. How does one make the decision? Now, many people talk about profit-making entities and loss-making entities, but that's not the way in which this decision needs to be made. And I will come to that in a moment. Let me say that the real decision is made on whether there is a market failure or not. Now, what do I mean by a market failure? A market failure comes about principally when goods and services are provided to consumers, but in the provision of those goods and services, the environment is not competitive. So it could be that there is a monopoly supplier in play. It could be that there are one or two suppliers, but who work together so that, consumers don't benefit in terms of price, quality, or availability. These are the kinds of market failures that the SOEs try to address. And you try to address this through the SOE system if and only if other mechanisms are not possible. So mechanisms such as the regulatory framework. Now, ideally, government should be looking at the regulatory framework to ensure that citizens get the right products at the right price and with a reasonable level of availability. And from the perspective of government, from the perspective of the state, what they really need to be interested in is in the provision of essential goods and services, not non-essential. So, for example, if chocolates are at a higher price, or if the quality of the chocolates is not good enough, should the government get involved in SOE, or should they try to regulate it? Probably not. But on the other hand, if it's an essential product, like say, for example, if it's gas, or if it's petroleum products, or if it's say rice, for instance, yes, then there is a case for some government involvement. I'm not saying that there should be SOEs to do this, but there should be some kind of involvement from the perspective of government. So the fundamental decision that would point in the direction of government getting involved or not remains and rests on this market failure. Are people being supplied with essential goods or services? If the answer is no, then the government needs to look at it. They need to figure out whether there is a good way in which they can get involved and supply those essential goods and services, or whether it should be left in private hands. Now, let me put this in the form of an example. I brought this example out at a recent seminar where I spoke. A lot of us in this country, we eat fish, but do we go out there and catch the fish that we eat? And the answer is no. There are many ways in which we can get the fish that we eat. So we can go to the Paliagoda market. We can wait for the fisherman to come down the street, on his bicycle. We can go to the supermarket. We can go to the fish market in the town. So there are many ways in which we can get the fish. We don't actually need to go and buy the fish. So similarly, when government needs to ensure that citizens of the country get essential goods and services, there are many ways in which government can make sure that happens. It doesn't actually need to be in the business of providing those goods and services. And the regulatory mechanism is one of those mechanisms. It can ensure that there are sufficient number of players in the private sector who will provide those goods through a competitive environment. And through that competitive environment, make sure that the price is right, make sure the quality is right, and make sure that the availability is satisfactory. So this is the fundamental manner in which a choice will be made, whether an enterprise needs to remain within government or whether it needs to be unchained from government and passed on to the private sector. Now, there is a lot of talk around this profit-making and loss-making entities. And, the story that does the rounds is that it's a loss-making entities that need to be privatized and the profit-making entities need to remain within government. Now, this is a major fallacy, and it's surrounded by a lot of misinformation. And to start with, just think about this. Today's loss-making enterprise can be tomorrow's profit-making enterprise. And in the meanwhile, if you have privatized it, then what happens? Do you take it back into government? Or at the same time, today's profit-making enterprise can be tomorrow's loss-making enterprise. So do you wait until a loss is made for you to privatize, right? So that's one aspect. The second aspect that a lot of people tend to forget when they talk about profit-making enterprises is that the profit that an enterprise makes does not belong to the shareholder, in this case, the government, but belongs to the shareholder. What comes to the shareholder is the dividends and not the profits. The profits remain within the company. So if a entity, a government-controlled entity, let's say it's a 100% owned entity, makes a profit of ₹1 billion but declares a dividend of 100 million rupees, the ₹1 billion or the 900 million rupees net of the dividend will remain in the company, and it is the 100 million which is declared as a dividend that will go to the government. Now, if you look at the last 10 years average of the dividends that have been declared by all the SOEs to government, as a component of government's revenue, it works out to about 0.5%. And this includes the dividends that have been declared by the state banks as well. So what the government actually gets in cash flow terms from the SOEs, the profit-making SOEs, is a very, very small component of its revenue, of its government revenue. This is point number 2. Point number 3 is if you take any entity, and we know this with the entities, the SOEs that are listed, if you were to actually divest the listed entities today at the market price, without a premium on the majority holding, just at its market price, and you invest the proceeds of that in a fixed deposit, the chances are that the fixed deposit interest that you will earn out of those proceeds is about 4 to 5 times the dividends that the enterprise will declare in any given year. So if you look at this from a purely cash flow terms, again, it makes sense to divest these entities. The fourth point to remember is that from every enterprise, whether you're a public enterprise or whether you're a private sector enterprise, the government collects money through the taxation system. So 15% of your revenue as VAT, another 2.5% these days as social security levy, again of the revenue, and 30% of the profit of the entity in the form of income tax comes to government. This is irrespective of whether it is controlled by government or by the private sector. Now, in addition, a public sector enterprise will provide government with the dividends. But the reality is that when you move these enterprises into the private sector, once you unchain it from government control, pass it on to the private sector and increase the productivity and the efficiency of these enterprises, what you lose from the dividend component, you will more than compensate via the taxation system, both in terms of VAT and in terms of income tax. So again, from a purely cash flow terms, this story about profit-making enterprises and loss-making enterprises simply doesn't hold water. But more important than all of this, and I believe that the biggest danger in making this case for profit-making enterprises and loss-making enterprises is that we are starting to focus government on profit. Now, when you start to focus government on profit, it tends to ignore its fundamental responsibility of providing services to the citizens. So take, for example, the case of law and order. If we focus government on profit, and as a citizen, if we go to the police station and try to make an entry, what is to stop the government saying, look, we need to create a profitable police force. So when you come to the police station and make an entry, you need to pay us 1,000 rupees or 2,000 rupees. What's stopping government from doing that if you focus government's attention on profits? We all know that the education and healthcare system in the country is free, particularly, and this is a service that is used by the lower income groups. Now, if we focus the attention of government on profits, when one of these low income group members go to the hospital or they want to enter their child into a school, government can turn around and say, very sorry, we need to create a profitable system, both the healthcare system and the education system. And so you need to pay us some money for this. So government will start to refocus on its primary responsibilities and try to make profit out of those as well. So to me, trying to focus the attention on government on making profits is an extremely dangerous position that we are taking. They have certain public interest obligations that they need to focus on, and government needs to do that. And the world has created a particular system to allow governments to get the resources it needs, the funds it needs to meet the expenditure on account of these public service obligations. And what is that system called? It's called the taxation system. It's only the government that has access to the taxation system. It is created so that government can get the necessary funds, the resources that it needs to meet its public service obligations. Why? Because we should never focus government's attention on profits. Profits is the purview of the private sector, not of the government. So to me, this is the real fundamental reason why we need to consider putting state-owned enterprises into private hands. Now, having said that, we must understand that there will be certain enterprises that will remain within government. So where there is a market failure and the government needs to get involved in the provision of essential goods and services, then those entities will remain within government. And we need to create the proper system to manage those enterprises. And that is part and parcel of the SOE restructuring process. And to me, sometimes I would think that this particular process is even more important than the whole process of privatization. And how do we manage these enterprises that remain within government? So before we find the answer, let me go back to the challenges, the reasons why the SOE sector in this country has really failed. And there are a couple of reasons. First and foremost, we park subsidies within these enterprises. Now, every government has the right and a responsibility, particularly if it has made promises during its election campaign, it has every right to give a subsidy to its citizens. Having said that, if the government does decide to give a subsidy to its citizens, it needs to take that subsidy onto its own balance sheet rather than the balance sheet of an entity through which it provides the subsidy. Case in point, the Ceylon Electricity Board or the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation. We've given subsidies both for fuel and also for power, but we've parked the subsidies within the entities. The entities, as a result of which, have had poor balance sheets. And as a result of those poor balance sheets, as you all know, we've had power cuts and we've had fuel shortages. And we very recently had a very dramatic increase in the price of all these service products that we get. So first, we need to have a system where we do not park these subsidies within these enterprises. That's number one. The second reason why the SOE sector has failed is because we've had poor management of these enterprises, starting with boards. We need to appoint fit and proper people to these boards, people with the right qualifications, the right experience, with the right capacity, and the right focus to run these businesses efficiently, effectively, and without being a burden on the state. But that's not what has happened in the past. In the past, these boards have been appointed fundamentally due to political reasons, not because the board members are the right people. So this again needs to change. The third reason why the SOE sector has failed is because through the political process, we've created jobs in entities. We've created jobs that are not existing. So as a result of which, a number of these SOEs have more people than they actually need, and they lead to greater losses. And the fourth reason that I find, having gone into some of these SOEs and looked at the way they operate, the fourth big reason that I find is that government systems and controls actually prevent enterprises from being efficient and effective. So let me take an example. If Sri Lankan Airlines was to, is at the moment trying to lease aircraft. Now, if Sri Lankan Airlines is a private sector entity, what it would do is it would make a proposal, the management would make a proposal to the board would look at it, and the board would decide, and possibly the lease, the decision to go ahead with the lease would probably happen within 4 to 6 weeks. In the government sector, it's significantly different. So the first thing you would do is you would need to get, so management would make a proposal to the board would consider it, and if the board were to approve it, it would go to the secretary of the ministry. If the secretary is happy with it, it would go to the minister. If the minister is happy with it, it would go to the cabinet. In the cabinet, the decision would be made by a group of people that have no knowledge about aircraft leasing. And at the end of it, the process is probably going to take something like 6 to 8 months. So what the private sector can do in 6 weeks, the government will end up doing in something like 6 months. And that again, the final decision will possibly be taken by people who really have a very little understanding about how aircraft leasing happens. So it's not an efficient system at all. And as a result of that, the company suffers as well. So these are the 4 fundamental reasons that I can attribute to and there are others as well, but these are the 4 big ones. And I think that any effort in restructuring the SOEs that remain within government need to address these 4 big issues. So do not park subsidies within commercial entities, number 1. We need to have a mechanism to appoint proper boards to these entities. We need to make sure that they are not overstaffed, and we need to have proper systems, efficient and effective systems and processes to allow these enterprises to become more efficient and more commercially oriented enterprises. So these are some of the things that we need to do within the enterprises that were to remain within government. Now, let me also go back to this whole thing about privatization for a moment, just so that listeners understand the process that is being followed. We are dealing with enterprises, at the end of the day, where there are 22 million people who are stakeholders. So we need to do this in a responsible way. We need to do this in a transparent way. And so we are following a particular process. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to get proper advisors to assist us in the privatization process. We've gone out there to get these advisors, again, through a very transparent process. We've advertised in both the local and international media. We've got responses through EOI and RFP process. And we are at this moment in time shortlisting or trying to finalize the transaction advisors for the entities that have been identified for privatization. Once that's done, once the advisors are appointed, then they will help us with due diligence on the sell side. They will also help us with valuations. They will help us to create data rooms. And then we will open up through a EOI and an RFP process once again to invite bids from anyone who is interested in making a proposal for any one of these enterprises. And there again, we will publish these EOIs and RFPs in the media, both the local and the international media. We'll allow anyone who wants to submit a proposal to submit those proposals. They will go through a proper evaluation process, and finally, the cabinet will make an award. So the process that we will follow is a very open, a very transparent process, because at the end of the day, all of us in the unit, we believe that we have a responsibility to all the citizens of this country. So with those initial few words, let me stop and hand you back to Dhananath, who's the moderator, and I'll be happy to take any questions that may come up during the rest of the event. Thank you.
Thank you, Suresh. Thank you very much. I hope I'm audible, and I kindly invite all our viewers to shoot your questions on the Q&A and share your questions. I'm looking forward to take your questions to the esteemed panelists. In the round of, basically, I will first go, I have prepared few questions, which I will first shoot to our esteemed panelists. And in the second round, I will take questions from the chat box. So I will try to do the maximum justice for all the questions which we have received. I will first start with Professor Samarjeeva. So basically, every time when a political party comes into power, they always say some economic model that they will follow, and they will always put the weight on the constitution. They will say the sovereignty of the constitution, and we are going to govern the country according to the constitution. So I went through the constitution, and I found on chapter 6, 2 or 3 interesting insights. And I will like to comment, I would like to get the comment from Professor Samarjeeva. So on chapter 6, on 27th sentence, it says on the directive principles of the state policy and the fundamental duties, it reads as the directive principle of state policy herein contained shall guide Parliament, the President and the Cabinet of Ministers in the enactment of laws and the governance of Sri Lanka for the establishment of a just and a free society. In the second sentence, it reads as the state is pledged to establish in Sri Lanka a democratic, socialist society, and the objectives which include, there are multiple objectives, and under F, 27.2F, it reads as the establishment of a just and a social order in which the means of production, distribution, and exchange are not concentrated and centralized in the state agencies or in the hands of privileged few, but are dispersed among the owned and all the people of Sri Lanka. So basically this says in the constitution that any of these resources cannot be concentrated either to the state or the state agencies. At the same time, for privileged few individuals, it could be also the private sector. And the government, this government has openly said that they are looking for a social market system where you are allowing the private sector to compete, but there will be a social safety net to take care of the most vulnerable people. So, Professor Samarjeeva, how do you see this state-owned enterprises reform agenda being complied with this constitution? Because we have to ensure that the resources are not concentrated on state or state agencies. At the same time, we have to make sure that during the restructuring process, if it goes for a private sector, even the same resources cannot be centralized or centered for few privileged individuals. How do you interpret, and what's your procedure on avoiding these two and being adherence for the constitution?
I am unfortunately a person who has been spending too much time reading constitutions and laws these days. because I was involved in getting rid of the 20th Amendment and so on. I think it's not a bad idea that you mentioned it. But the very fact that for the last 40 years, we have allowed the concentration of economic power, both in the state and in the private sector, shows that this particular chapter, chapter 6, I believe, actually has been disregarded by everybody, by all parties. Because unlike the fundamental rights chapter that comes after it, this chapter is not justiciable. You can't go to court saying it has been violated. Now, when it comes to constitutions, I have my favorites and I have my least favorite. And the Brazilian constitution, which, for example, had a provision which said that the telecommunications company had to be a state-owned monopoly inside the constitution. And therefore, when they did the reforms, they had to first do a constitutional amendment, is my least favorite. So I believe that particularly where technology changes, market conditions change, we should try not to write these things into constitutions, but to generally have the overall principle. I can state the basic principle, which I think Suresh also brought up, which was the governing credo of the public interest program unit that I set up and headed back in 2002 to 2004, which was competition wherever possible, regulation where necessary. I think that sort of tells the story much better than the long-winded language used in the Constitution that was most probably written by Mr. H.W. Jayawardena. So I think that is the key point: competition wherever possible, regulation where necessary. Because if you do that, you not only get the efficiency benefits that Suresh talked about, you not only get the taxation revenues that he also referred to, you also get the people of the country getting the goods and services at the prices and quality that they desire. And I think given the particular situation that we are in, where we have to give priority to exports, I think we have to also think about quite a lot of these services like telecommunications, like electricity. These are input costs for exporters. And if we do not have competitive, high quality input industries, our exporters are going to be disadvantaged. So I would prefer to look at it in those terms. But of course, I think it's very important that you brought up the constitutional directives, which people like Suresh and so on can refer to as they face the inevitable criticisms about selling the family silver and various such inanities.
Thank you, Professor Samarajiva. Mr. Manjula, in a recent op-ed that you have written, you have basically mentioned that not all SOEs are loss-making and neither all SOEs are profit-making. So the question is, now if it is only, I think Suresh also touched upon this, it is only the profits and losses to be considered, or Suresh basically brought out a mechanism of the market failure. If there's a market failure, that you intervene. So then someone actually can question, as an example, now the telecom, the market works. I mean, there are private players, there's a government player. So why the government is so focused on privatizing profit-making ones, or what's the structure? Because the markets are also working. That's one part of the question. The second part is, even if you look at the petroleum, there's no privatization or there's no restructuring. They have basically opened it for competition. They have allowed 2 more players to enter the market. So what is your framework of deciding on restructuring? Are we going to open it for more players, or actually are we going for a hard restructuring like what the assignment that Suresh has been given for, and why the profit-making ones, and according to Suresh's argument itself, if the markets are working, why should we actually privatize or restructure some of these institutes?
Yeah, there is a serious misconception that only loss-making SOEs need to be restructured. Suresh also alluded to that. But if you really look at the numbers, Dhananath, you'll find that actually only about 1/3 of the SOEs actually make a loss in a given year. The rest of them are profitable. And out of the loss-making entities also, you find that typically in most years, it's about 2 or 3 entities that contribute to well over 90% of the loss. And in some years, actually, it can even go up to as high as 96 or 98%. So if that is the case, and if the sole purpose of this SOE restructuring is to deal with loss-making entities and reduce the financial burden on the government, I mean, then all you need to do is to just focus on these 2 or 3 entities, and that issue can be tackled. I mean, it is absolutely important that we tackle that, but the SOE restructuring program that the government has embarked on through the unit that is under the leadership of Suresh is going far beyond that, right? Because we find that even in the case of profit-making entities, there are quite a few good reasons why one should look at restructuring, even going up to divestment. And Suresh did cover a few reasons for that, and I will add a few more why even profitable entities may require restructuring or even divestment. So now one of these is that now if you take a commercial enterprise, whether owned by the state or the private sector, they need continuous investment in capital to keep on upgrading its services, its products, and so on, and to make sure that they operate at their maximum potential, right? So if you don't have the capacity to keep injecting capital, these entities will find it very difficult to compete with their peers. Now, I mean, a good example will be like a hotel. Now, you know how long it has been taking the Hilton Hotel to complete its refurbishment program, which still up to this date, they have not been able to complete. So that is going to put them at a disadvantage when they have to compete with all the other hotels that are around, including the new ones that are coming in. Now, on the other hand, say if these entities can be divested and with enhanced investment and private sector management, if they are able to generate a higher profit, then like Suresh said, you may be able to generate more revenue to the government by way of taxes rather than the dividend that it would have been otherwise generating for the government. Now, I think again, I'll give you an example. If you take, for example, the distilleries company, substantial tax revenue is being collected from that business. Whereas if it remained under the state, I'm not sure whether you could have got that kind of a revenue stream by way of a dividend. And also, government has to look at other priorities. Now, this particularly in times like this, you need cash to pay the salaries, to pay pensions, for cash transfers to support the needy and the vulnerable groups and so on. And when you are really strapped for cash, I mean, can you justify investing in upgrading a hotel or modernizing a factory? You can't, it's much rather that those funds are diverted into those essential needs that the government is obliged to provide. So that's again a very good reason why you may look to move out of these non-strategic areas and release funds for other priorities. And again, another area is now, right now, we are badly in need of foreign exchange. So at a time like this, if say some of these divestments can attract foreign investment, so that will be an added bonus, because then you are going to bring in some much needed foreign currency into the country. But I can see a lot of comments these days talking about the outflow of foreign currency by way of profits. But you have to understand that the profits will start moving out gradually over a period of time. But first of all, there will be a substantial investment to start with, right? At the point of the transaction, you are going to start with an inflow. And then, of course, subsequently, there will be outflows, no doubt. And this inflow also can be twofold, because in the case of some of these businesses, they will have to first pay a price to the government to take ownership of that entity, and thereafter further investment may be needed. If you take the Hyatt, for example, now what we have as the Hyatt is only a building, right? It will require substantial investment to make that into an operating hotel. So sometimes maybe the double the amount that is needed, that will have to be spent on acquiring the ownership might have to be committed overall by way of an investment. So that's again, something.
Thank you, Mr. Manjula. I will come back to you on reiterating that point. I would like to move to Suresh for the best interest of time. Thank you, Manjula, for that insights. Suresh, I think there's already a question I can quickly take up, but also I would like to add something more onto it. I think there was a question asking, in terms of your shortlisting processes of financial advisors, it is mainly I think the shortlisted parties are, mainly none of the international agencies have applied. Is it because of the dilution of the trustworthiness is one question. I would also like to add to that, Suresh. So what's the assurance that you can provide now? Getting these transactions through a financial advisor is the best way. And what's the assurance that this will not be a corrupt deal? Because as far as I understand, still, even through the financial advisors, are you going to give it away for the highest bidder, or what's in the restructuring process? How do you prioritize this decision? And are you going to recommend it to the cabinet, or is the cabinet, are you going to recommend something like option 1, 2, 3 as to the cabinet, or is the cabinet the final decision maker? In that sense, isn't it still room for the cabinet at the cabinet level to make a corrupt decision, if I were to use those words, and completely dilute or erode the public trust on this process? And how to avoid, what are the governance structures you have within the unit to ensure that these processes and the transactions are transparent? I think one gentleman has also asked, how can we get access to Suresh's unit? I think you can answer all those questions in one go.
Yes, thank you, Dharanath. So our unit is based at the Temple Trees premises. It's the 3rd floor of the Lotus Tower, the Lotus building within the Temple Trees complex. So that's where we are, that's where we sit. In terms of the cabinet decision, Dharanath, yes, what we will likely do is we will give for each one of the transactions, we will list out the people who have been shortlisted, and of course we will make a recommendation, and the recommendation will also say why the recommendation is being made. Now, from that point onwards, the cabinet has every right to either accept the recommendation that has been made, or it can, if it wants to, look at some other option. So obviously that will lie at the table of the cabinet. In terms of the process, a couple of things. So first and foremost, like I said, we will be publishing the EOI RFP process through both the local and international media, which gives everyone who wants to make an offer, leaves open the option for them to send in the proposals. The EOIs and the RFPs will be well structured. That will be part of the work for the transaction advisor, so that there will be no, how can I say, space for any misunderstandings. We'll try to tighten that process as much as possible. And also, Dhananath, what I must say is that the process is such that the decisions in terms of shortlisting, evaluating, etc., lies with a cabinet-appointed procurement committee. So whilst the state-owned enterprise restructuring unit facilitates the process, we don't actually shortlist any bids, or nor do we look at the financial proposals and shortlist based on that. It's done by a completely independent unit. So that's the process that is followed. So the transaction advisors give us the assistance. We facilitate the process. There are experts that look at that evaluate the proposals that have been received, and then of course it goes to cabinet with the different options available, and of course with a recommendation, and then it will be the decision of the cabinet thereafter. So Dhananath, that was on that. I also answered the question as to how we can be contacted. What were the other questions? Sorry, I lost some.
Why the international financial advisors haven't been applied?
Well, Dhananath, actually that's not right. I mean, there were so for almost all the proposals we received had a local component and as well as an international component together. I think there were only 1 or 2 proposals where there was only a local party, but everything else had both was a partnership between a local entity, a local investment bank, and or one of the big 4 firms, and a foreign investment bank. But let me put it this way. I mean, we expected a lot more proposals to come in. We didn't get the number of proposals we thought we might get, and that could be a reflection of a couple of things. It could be the current economic conditions in the country. It could also be that in the past we've gone down this road, but we've not, completed the process. So there may be a question mark as to whether this time again, we will go halfway and pull back. The third also could be in the current context, the transaction size. So these could be some of the reasons why we didn't get the kind of response that we would have liked. It was a decent response, but we expected more.
Suresh, just an additional question. Sorry, you have anything to complete? Sorry, go ahead. Yeah,
I just wanted to add to one of the points that Manjula made about the need to invest in some of these state-owned enterprises, right? So to me, I know I've been in the private sector for many years. I'm really from the private sector, and I've been CEO of a company for many, many years. And the one thing I know, Dhananath, is one of the greatest strengths for an organization is to know that your parent or that your major shareholder has the financial resources to invest within the organization when required, right? Or let me put it the other way, one of the greatest weaknesses of an organization is to have a major shareholder who is financially challenged. And Sri Lanka is in that position right now. So Sri Lanka is financially challenged. And so if the Sri Lankan government is a major shareholder in any one of these enterprises, if I was in one of those enterprises, I would be really worried, because we are in a competitive framework. So take entities like, say, Sri Lanka Telecom, for instance. At this moment in time, it has tremendous competition in any case from its main competitor. We also know that its main competitor is in the process of tying up with one of the other competitors in the sector. So SLT, for instance, is going to be faced with greater competition in the future. It also needs to invest a lot in its technology. The telecom sector is an important sector when it comes to the economy of the country. And so as a country, we expect these entities to expand, to improve, to improve its technology, and so on and so forth. And it's going to need injection of capital into these businesses. And the government of Sri Lanka, as we all know, doesn't have the requisite funds to make those investments. So that's point number one. And of course, we are now talking about a very unusual circumstance, right? But even under normal circumstances, Dhananath, when a government, and particularly a government in a developing country, every government for that matter, has limited resources. None of us, even in our private lives, have all the money, have all the resources that we need. We all have limited resources. And so we got to prioritize where we use these limited resources. And so even under normal circumstances, from the perspective of a citizen, when the government is faced with investment decisions, do we invest in the healthcare system? Do we invest in the education system? Do we invest in road infrastructure? Do we invest in maintaining let's say, our irrigation system, for example, right? Or do we invest this money in Sri Lankan Airlines, or do we invest in Lanka hospitals? You know, where do we want, where as citizens, where do we want these funds invested? Is it in Sri Lankan Airlines? Is it in Lanka hospitals? Is it in Sri Lanka Telecom? Or is it in the healthcare sector? Is it in the education sector? Or is it in the road network? So, you know, these are very, very fundamental questions. And I can tell you, as a citizen of this country, I mean, my personal take is that we need to prioritize our investments in education, in healthcare, in road infrastructure, etc., etc. And if there is somebody else who is willing to invest in say, Sri Lanka Telecom or in Sri Lankan Airlines, let's welcome that, you know, because it reduces our responsibility of finding the money for those enterprises. So that's another point that I wanted to make in line with what Manjula was saying.
Suresh, very quick additional question on the initial remark you made on the process, because I think quite a few investors are also, and partners who are interested on these SOEs are also in the, probably on this call. So you mentioned that you are just facilitating the process as the unit, and there's a procurement committee and experts who will be evaluating the bids and which will be submitted to the cabinet. We all know, Suresh, yes, we all know there can be technical corruption, or we call the white collar crime. So basically, if you are coming from a reputable background, I think a lot of people may have trust on you and the committee, but we really do not know who will be in that procurement committee. Isn't there a room on, isn't it dangerous to avoid that? I mean, you are basically leaving out to a procurement committee because the public trust and the appointment is on you. And based on each transaction, I think you are considering a sizable number of SOEs. Each requires a different expert. And isn't there a room at this procurement committee appointments, still the political parties and the politicians and whoever, even in the private sector, isn't there a room for corruption? Are you still confident that this is the right process?
So, Dhananath, I mean, every process can have its flaws, right? There is never a bulletproof system. But I think within the system that we have, and this is the government procurement rule, these are not rules that we are inventing. These are the rules that we have to follow. So within the given circumstances, I think we've got to make sure that the right people are in these different, are in the different slots. So that's something that we will look at.
Thank you, Suresh. I will move to Professor Samarajiva. You have also raised the hand, but I will add one more question. I think the current topic is, I think you have responded on the national security issues. So in some of the state-owned enterprises, I think the big elephant in the room, I think it's a social conversation now, whether with the parliamentary committee mentioning that some transactions like SLT may cause threat to the national security. What would be your response? That's number one. Also, I would like to add, you have been a regulator. Do Sri Lanka really have that regulatory capacity to regulate wherever you mentioned best is the competition, and wherever necessary to regulate, do we really have the proper regulators and regulatory mechanism? Because let's take a look at the example as PUCSL and even the CAA, the Consumer Affairs Authority, where they only impose price controls, and PUCSL, we saw that the chairman has been removed. So in this context, how do you justify a proper regulation, Professor Samarajiva, addressing also the national security question? And also you have raised hand, I think, to address some of the other comments. Floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. I raised my hand because I think for those who know this awful subject of procurement, I think we should understand that having two entities One, to handle the drafting of the terms of reference, the collation of the material and so on, and to have a completely separate entity doing the final decision is considered good practice. And that is found, for example, in the UN and various other places as well. And having run various kinds of procurement procedures compatible with World Bank rules and so on, I can tell you that that is common, and it is a good practice, in fact, to have two bodies. It gives you checks and balances. I think even in the case of Sri Lanka Telecom, the issue here, we can use the example, because you see there are some people who are talking about Sri Lanka Telecom being, privatized for the first time. Absolutely not. The Sri Lanka Telecom privatization happened in 1997. Their PERC, the Public Enterprise Reform Commission, did the kind of work that Suresh's unit is doing, along with external consultants, and a cabinet-appointed committee, a technical committee headed by, I think, which had Mr. Logeswaran, who was the secretary of the Telecom Ministry, Professor Samaranayaka from the University of Colombo, and so on, were on that committee. So they actually pulled together a completely separate unit to do the the decision making. And I think everybody was quite happy that when the highest estimation of the money that would have been received by that was $150 million in the middle of a war, actually 225 million was realized. So I think we need to take some hope and some encouragement, I think, against the pervasive cynicism that we seem to be afflicted by, to say things have been done and they have been done well in this country and we can do them again. Now, the question of national security, again, I think I have answered this endlessly to media. National security is not a slogan. You have to look at the particular form of the threat. And you have to say what can be done about it. And in most of these cases, when you look at the specific forms, you find that having the politicians in government, giving them the right to appoint the board members, in some cases, for example, appointing a presidential sibling as the chairman of the board, doesn't actually give you national security. It may even harm national security. And furthermore, a lot of these people don't understand that today the telecom sector is not the telecom sector of 1989, when this argument carried weight, and it carried weight. It persuaded even Mr. Lalita Tulatudali, who many people think of as some great liberal reformer. And Lalit was one of the reasons why the privatization that was planned in 1989 didn't happen, because he bought this argument. He was also the Minister of National Security. And the unions came up with this argument and Lalit bought it. So in the middle of a war, an intense national security threatened situation, the government did privatize this company and gave complete management control to the Japanese company NTT, including the positions of CEO, CFO, and so on, which were written into the management contract. I'm not going to spend time on it, but an actual national security threat, which was the non-redundancy affecting the international gateway, was addressed by the regulator and by the private entity that was managing SLT way better than when it was 100% government owned and not subject to regulation. So I think the more important thing is that we must have regulation, not only in terms of sort of conventional economic regulation, but on issues such as cybersecurity and so on. And we have to understand that that doesn't apply to one company, that it's pervasive, that today telecommunication services, data services, etc., are provided by a multiplicity of companies. So, for example, the communication that is occurring here, I don't think this has any great bearing on national security, is handled by a foreign company, and the data related to this conversation is somewhere else, not here, right? So a lot of people don't disregard these things. So you need to be realistic, and you need to be focused, and you need to find solutions that are appropriate for the problems that are foreseen, rather than see national security as some kind of slogan or a sutra that you sort of, it's not an incantation. And I see the Parliamentary Oversight Committee's report as a form of incantation rather than a fact-based analysis. Your last question was about regulatory capacity. Yes, there is a problem with regulatory capacity. Part of it has to do with people. Part of it has to do with procedures. So, for example, when you take an electricity tariff proposal and submit it to a regulator and expect a decision in 2 weeks, that suggests that you don't really expect the regulator to make a reasoned, evidence-based judgment, and that you expect some kind of rubber stamping or some symbolic activity, regulatory theater, as I call it. So I think you really need to understand the process of regulation, what each of these decisions mean, and you also have to ensure that the regulatory tools that are used are the ones that are most appropriate for the country. So just to give you one example, for tariffs in an area like telecommunications, we don't normally recommend tariff regulation these days. What we do is we recommend some kind of forbearance, where you have the authority to go in, but for the most part, you don't actually formally regulate tariffs because there are enough suppliers. So you look at the conditions under which tariff regulation can be foreborne, and you look at the unusual circumstances. Like, for example, with regard to a cable station or something like that, where there may be necessity. There's only one cable station or 2 cable stations, landing stations, and there may be some requirement to ensure that the tariffs charged in those locations are regulated. So it has to do with good regulatory practice. And of course, you need to pay people good salaries, and you need to create good working environments. Those kinds of things, I think, are being grappled with all over the world, and not only in developing countries. It is said that in the United States and in Canada and places like that, they have problems of regulatory capacity. So you need to address those head on with the appropriate solutions.
Thank you, Professor Samarajiva. I will quickly move to Mr. Manjula. I'm also taking some questions from our Q&A chat box. Mr. Manjula, you have mentioned in a recent op-ed that this privatization is not a new process. I think since, according to your op-ed, which I am not knowledgeable enough, there has been about 80 privatizations being done since, I think, for the last few decades. It's not, I think often it has been cited, the Sri Lanka Telecom being one of the successful privatizations, but you have said till early 2000, there has been multiple privatizations being done. So the question is, if it's not new, and why there's another unit and this process has been done, and in that case, why are we going to do it again and again? Because people also think that the current, sometimes the economic system is the problem for all the hardships that we go through. In the same time, since you have also served as a member of the PERC committee, Rehana and Himal have asked, how do we get the public buying for SOE reforms? And from a communications perspective, did you do anything right when you were a part of it? You can respond to that. Suresh, I will come back to you afterwards.
Yeah, thanks, Dannath. So let me start off with the first question. Yeah, actually, this is something I think a lot of people, the younger members of the audience probably are not aware that between 1989 to 2002, there have been something like 84 or 85 privatizations, both full or partial. And interestingly, about half of them happened during the period 1989 to 94, and the balance half afterwards from about 94 to 2002, right? Under two different regimes led by two different political parties. So that shows, I mean, there was a time when across the political divide, I mean, there was some kind of consensus that this is the way to go. And although, like, I mean, we always hear of SLT as a success story, which no doubt it is, but there are plenty of others as well. So just to remind ourselves of a few, I will mention a few names, like, for instance, Putlam Cement, which is going as INSEE today. Then Cinnamon Grand and Cinnamon Lakeside Hotels. Lanka Lubricants operating as Caltex. Even United Motors, Ceylon Oxygen, Tire Corporation, Hotels Corporation, Lanka Milk Foods. I mean, you can talk of so many entities. I'm sure many are not even aware that these were at one time state-owned enterprises. But just look at them. I mean, today, I mean, they are adding value to all their stakeholders. I mean, you don't see the customers complaining. You don't see the employees complaining. I mean, they are all very happy. They are being looked after, right? Of course, unfortunately, what happened was, now at the time, actually, I was in PERC. So we had a list of about 50 more entities, right? We were working on preparing them for divestment. I mean, just like Suresh's unit is currently doing. Actually, we had a slightly bigger team of professionals of about 20 odd. So we were able to sort of simultaneously work on quite a significant number of entities. So they were at different stages of the process. So some we had even got proposals from investors. They were about to be finalized. Some were at the stage of being advertised. Others, we were just in the process of selecting financial advisors and so on, right? But unfortunately, of course, with the change of government that happened in 2004, this entire program was abandoned. And not only that, even the work as an institution was scrapped by an act of parliament. It was terminated, and you can't even find the files. I think that would have been of great use to Suresh had some of that documentation been available. So just to describe PERC's approach, coming on to the second part of your question, Dhananath, actually what we did is quite similar to what the SRU is currently trying to do. We had a similar process. I mean, we always try to appoint a transaction advisor for each transaction and worked with the advisors. And there was also like a steering committee, typically headed by the secretary to the line ministry, under which that SOE was operating. So because there's quite a bit of work to be done before actually you can take an enterprise to the market. So that helped to get some of the background work done, working together with the transaction advisor. And then of course, when it comes to the selections, we still had the same procurement committee system. To come back to the other aspect, yes, the communication part is absolutely important, because no matter at any given time, I mean, now here we are talking 20 years from that time, right? Again, but the moment you start embarking on this kind of an exercise, you find a lot of miscommunication, a lot of misperceptions coming up, right? So we need to tackle these. And we need to do that in a systematic manner. And actually, at that time, we were just beginning to approach it in that scientific manner, where we were looking at each enterprise and trying to identify the stakeholders of each entity and trying to understand how a restructuring or a divestment would impact each of those groups, right? And trying to anticipate how would they react if something like a privatization were to take place. So that would help us to sort of prepare in advance how we will deal with each group. And of course, obviously, you will have to consult each of them as well. I think in the SLT privatization that happened beautifully, and in a lot of the other cases also. Otherwise, I don't think we could have successfully completed so many transactions at that time. So it's absolutely important to address that aspect of identifying the issues well in advance, coming up with a plan, and rolling out a very good communication program. I mean, which should be both at a generic level, like, you know, what we are doing today is actually part of that, trying to make people understand why we have to do this, but also specifically relating to each entity. Also, there has to be a
Thank you.
lesson plan.
Thank you, Mr. Manjula. Suresh, over to you. I will also get a question from the chat box. Someone has asked, what is the delay in listed companies being privatized? These are very straightforward. What is the delay? If we start somewhere, it will send a positive signal to the investing committee. With that, you can make your remarks, Suresh.
Yeah, so I will start with that, Dhananath. There are two other points that I want to address. I know, I mean, like a lot of people ask me this question, why can't we just, you know, appoint a broker, give the shares over and have them sold on the stock exchange? Possible. But, you know, again, like I said earlier, we are responsible not just to the Secretary to the Treasury who owns the shares, but we are responsible to the citizens of the country. So we need to follow a good process at the end of the day. And you know, at a minimum, we need to get a valuation done because we are selling a majority stake here. And you simply don't sell a majority stake, you know, by just appointing a broker and putting it into the market. So valuation needs to be done. And if the investors' data rooms need to be created, why data room? Because if you have credible investors, they will want to do a due diligence. You know, if an investor doesn't want to do a due diligence and is willing to pay, you know, 10-15 billion rupees to buy an entity and doesn't want to do a due diligence, you need to ask the question where that money is coming from. So there is a process that needs to be followed. So the due diligence will take time. We need to allow people who want to bid. So the whole EOI RFP process. So yes, you can go put the shares on the market and sell them, but that may not be the responsible thing to do. So that's the reason why we are following a particular process. So that's number one. In terms of the points that I wanted to make, I will deal with the response Manjula was giving in terms of the communication strategy. Absolutely right. We need to have a good communication strategy. We are working on it at the moment. And you should see the results of that communication strategy being rolled out in maybe a few days or a few weeks going forward. The point that I wanted to really address was the question that you put to Rohan on national security. A lot of talk around the national security to get you know, in combination with Sri Lanka Telecom. But let me take this from a completely different angle. And Dhananath, before I do that, a question to you. How much fossil fuel do we use in power generation, or how much of our power is generated through fossil fuels, coal and diesel? Roughly about 55-60%?
I think so. I really do not have the numbers, but I think as far as I remember, it's about, 50-60%.
Yeah, okay. So just think about this, Dhananath, right? I mean, in terms of national security, if we don't have power in this country, imagine the consequences to national security under those conditions, right? Now, just think, where does this fossil fuel come from? Do we own the source from where the fossil fuel comes from? No, we don't. And, you know, all these fossil fuels are imported, right? Do we own the ships that import them? We don't. So isn't that a much greater national security threat than, you know, some communication channel? So, you know, the point I'm making here is somebody with vested interest points us in a particular direction, and then without thinking too much, we start running behind it. But actually, if you sit and analyze this, right, the national security threats come from elsewhere, not necessarily from from a telco sector. And, again, I think we need to think through this. If you take, say, the United States, for example, it's one of the most security conscious countries in the world. I don't think any of their telcos are government owned. So what about the whole national security of a country like the United States? Is it compromised? I doubt it. And the other thing to think of, Dhananath, is, however tight we might set things up in Sri Lanka, and so let's assume that having a telco under government control leads to national security, okay? Now, we send out a communication from here and it goes to, say, the United States. Now, at the United States side, that is not controlled by government. It's controlled by some private sector entity, right? So if we are saying that a private sector, by having these telcos in the private sector, there is a threat to the national security, it doesn't matter how tight your controls are at this end, if the controls at the other end are controlled by some private sector entity. So what's this conversation all about? I mean, it really has no basis. So that's the other point that I wanted to make. And Dhananath, can I just make one other final point in this whole process of privatization? Yeah, we talk about these entities as being national assets, right? I mean, somebody mentioned the sale of the family silver. We say these are national assets. Now, to me, a national asset is an asset that we can leverage to really develop this country and change the face of this country, make it, make it a developed nation, and so on and so forth. Right now, will any one of these enterprises contribute to that process, or is it something else that's going to contribute to this process? So, when I look at it from the perspective of a national asset, to me, a national asset is not a commercial entity. A national asset is the youth of this country, right? A national asset is the ocean that surrounds our nation, because that ocean has a lot of wealth which we can extract to transform this country. A national asset is our irrigation system, because if we leverage that properly, we will transform our whole agricultural system, right? A national asset is our healthcare system. A national asset is our education system. Which I mean, think about it. We have free education for the entire country, for all the kids of our country. No, that's a tremendous national asset, and we need to invest more in that asset as against invest in some commercial enterprise. So, I mean, none of these commercial enterprises are really national assets. National assets are somewhere else. And when we focus our attention to these commercial enterprises and say they're national assets, what we are really doing is we are ignoring the true national assets of this country, and a result of which we remain stagnant in terms of our economy and in our development path, okay? So we need to be very, very careful and very mindful when we speak about these commercial enterprises as being national assets, because they really aren't. The national assets are elsewhere, and it's on those national assets that we need to focus on.
Thank you, Suresh. I think Mr. Tilak Balapiti has confirmed it's about 48% is the fossil fuel for power generation. Very quickly, since you're on the spot, there's another question by Raveen Basnaika. When do you think the first batch of entities listed for restructure would be completed? Do you have a quick answer for that, Suresh?
I'm sure Raveen is asking about when the first privatization should happen. At the moment, we are looking at the fourth quarter of this year.
Okay. Thank you, Suresh. Coming back to Professor Samarajiva, there's another question. In the instance of SLT, there is a monopoly granted to the entity on fixed lines. Is there, if there is divestment, how will this be handled? I think it's also part for Suresh, but since you have been the regulator, how do you recommend to handle? This is again an anonymous question on the chat box.
Well, there is really no reason why there should be a monopoly, because this was a sort of throwaway line in the Suntel and Lankabel licenses that was there to placate the unions, and the intention was throughout to take it out. But well, that didn't happen. But other companies have bought, now, for example, there was a company called MTT towers, MTT, I believe, towers and transmission or something, which had the ability to lay fiber. So that has been used to lay fiber to certain locations, not to residential premises, but to certain other locations. The bottom line is, in an ideal case, you would have a new act and you would strip out, you would have a new act and you would issue new licenses. That would be a complicated process. But if there are any provisions in licenses, you see, the SLT license doesn't have a provision saying they have a monopoly. It's that the Suntel and Lankabel licenses had some provisions. So you could change those and then the problem would go away. So there is that larger question of remediating the policy and legislative environment. But, you know, I mean, reforms don't happen in a nice linear fashion. You have to sometimes work in parallel. And it can be done in all sorts of ways. I believe some attention is being paid to the fact that we are working with a 30-something-year-old telecommunications act, which by all measures, you know, in a rapidly changing technological and market environment, is a completely obsolete document. And there have been problems like the Silreddy case identified about the fact that the safeguards that were built into the original act are not even functioning or not even working, to the extent that that amount of money could be taken out for a non-telecom related purpose. So there's a whole raft of reasons why we need to change the act. And I hope some activity is going on where the act will be reformed in parallel with the restructuring of Sri Lanka Telecom.
Professor Samarajiva, before, I think that we are getting a lot of questions, but also could you explain, I think there's another perception in the society that Singapore runs these all state-owned enterprises very well. They pay pretty much dividends for their people. These are the conversation in the society. If Singapore can do it, why can't we? And they have a model called Temasek model. There's another conversation about a Khazanah model. Can you elaborate what's the context? Why can't Sri Lanka do it in the same format? What is the structure about this Temasek and Singapore doing the state-owned enterprises, including their airline? Can you shed light on this, please?
Well, I think the larger question is, I don't think we have, depending on how you count, maybe over 400 state-owned enterprises. And I don't think there is a single solution. And especially, there cannot be a single solution, which is a sort of Temasek model that will hold all these SOEs. So you need a multifaceted approach. And I have no objection to the Temasek or Khazanah model being applied for a small subset of entities. I wrote about this quite a lot. I think it was Venerable Aturalgi Ratana and his organization that first brought up this idea before the 2015 election. And it was not a very well thought out idea. So I thought I should really drill into it about what are the problems with it, because that model, without too much thinking, was applied in Bhutan, and a company called Druk Holdings was created, which was, well, I would say it was a failure or an unmitigated disaster, depending on how you measure these things. So you have to really look at the elements. What are the kinds of companies that go in? They are all listed in the stock exchange. They have no social objectives. So, for example, the housing authorities, etc., are not listed under Temasek. They are kept completely separate. And they are subject to regulation. So even Temasek operated companies have been, Singtel, for example, has been given some hefty fines by the IDA, which is the Singapore Regulatory Authority. So there are a whole series of things that need to be done to make a model like that work. I don't want to take up all the time talking about Temasek, because I think Temasek, Khazanah, I think we also have to look at one MDB, which was also a fund that used to own some of these things. Think about these things. I think there's enough written. I think if you put my name and Temasek or something on the internet, some of those writings should come up for anybody who wants the details. So one of the things that I pointed out was that, you see, Temasek can hold the companies that it owns accountable. And it doesn't only own Singapore government companies. It even had shares in Airtel. It even had shares in the Australian telecom company, Optus, I believe, right? So it buys, goes into particular segments, particular national markets. It basically looks at it in terms of investment. And it also divests as necessary. So it'll bring down its ownership. It'll put it back in the share market and so on. And one of the things that I pointed out was that for a significantly long period, not now, Temasek was even headed by, the Prime Minister's wife, who was an accomplished professional in her own right, but part of the sort of the first family. So things that work in Singapore probably won't work in that particular form in Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Professor Samarajiva. Manjulu, you have raised your hand. You can go ahead. Then I'll come back to Suresh. There are quite a few questions on the process and things like that. Then I can direct those questions to Suresh.
Yeah, Dhannath. No, I just want to make one comment regarding this suggestion on why not, put some of these companies on the stock market and sell them off. See, the government has to manage two conflicting objectives. On one hand, it has to ensure that, you get the best price. So from that perspective, yes, it may be a good idea putting it in the market because that probably helps you to get the best possible value. But at the same time, there is a responsibility to make sure that you're divesting ownership of these entities to a responsible investor, right? Because you have some kind of an obligation towards the employees of the entity, the customers, and like, Suresh was constantly mentioning, at the end of the day, what we want is to create something better for all stakeholders, including, of course, the customers. So if you just put it on the market, there's always a possibility that somebody might just pick it up for asset stripping, right? Or may have some other different motive, right? So that is why it is necessary to go through this kind of a selection process, shortlisting investors, trying to see their credentials. But there is a way of marrying the two, right? So that's what I just wanted to suggest here. What one can do is, like, say, you can go through an extensive evaluation process, and let's say you pick 2 or 3 potential investors who are, as good as each other, right? So all 3 are equally good, and you have no concerns, right? So then you can put the company on the stock market. There is a special board to do that, and where you can introduce as an as a parcel on an all or nothing basis, as they call it, and then let these 3 companies bid against each other, and you can realize the best price. And as long as these are all 3 are screened parties, you're indifferent as to whether who would actually get it. So this was actually done for several companies in the past. So you could probably see, I remember Lanka Milk Foods and few other entities, even maybe some plantation companies, this particular methodology was followed. So that's what I just wanted to add here.
Thank you, Ms. Manjula. Suresh, there are a few questions from the audience. First is from Nigel Bartholomew. He asked, the classic cases for privatization are probably Sri Lankan Airlines and HDL, the owning company of the Colombo Hilton. If my information is accurate, the debt drag of accumulated debt in these companies are far outweighs any operating profit or loss. So his first question is, what tools would you employ, or do you have any, do you have at your disposal to park that accumulated debt in a SPV and privatized the SOE as a going concern. And he has given an example as Air India. That's one question. And also there's a question in the background of our recent history of enacting an expropriation act in the revival of underperforming enterprises and underutilized assets act of 2011, which was repealed. What comfort does your unit have to offer potential investors in the SOE that this won't happen again? Those are the two main questions I would like to direct it to you, Suresh.
Yeah, Dhananath, in terms of Nigel's question, that is something that is being looked at. How do we treat the debts of some of the enterprises if the debt load being carried in the balance sheets are too large? So we are looking at that. I mean, we are aware of the issue, aware of the challenge. We are trying to see how we can sort that out. There are conversations that are happening around that. And I think by the time the divestitures come into play, hopefully we would have resolved those issues. So that's number one. Number two, sorry, Dhananath, what was the other question? Oh yeah, in terms of the Underperforming Assets Act. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I do believe, so investor protection is extremely important in these divestitures. I do believe there is another team that is working on a policy framework and legislation that will give some comfort to investors. So I think there is an investor protection law that is being worked on.
Okay, thanks, Suresh. There are two questions I will quickly, I think you can answer it very quickly. Some of the questions you all already touched upon it. There's an anonymous question asking, is there, what would stop the cabinet from going against the recommendation of the of your unit? Is the transparency to the public of this recommendation to understand of the cabinet has decided against it? Is one question. And I think also there's a question on mainly on the communication side. I think Mr. Rabi Surya has asked, how do you counterattack the involvement of religious leaders and some other parties who are basically bringing this aspect out? Is there a communication plan which is planning to roll out? If you could quickly answer those two questions, I think we have about 10 more minutes to wrap this conversation.
Yeah, Dhananath, at the end of the day, I mean, what we can do is make a recommendation to cabinet. And of course, cabinet has the power to take its own decisions. So what the cabinet does, I mean, nobody can give an assurance. I think we've just got to say that cabinet has the power to decide. I don't foresee that they will go against a sound recommendation. I can't foresee that happening. So I think we will probably have to leave that at that. In terms of the communication strategy, yes, we are looking at multiple ways of dealing with multiple challenges. It's not a one solution fits all. We need to know we are working on who the stakeholders, what the messaging to each stakeholder, who will carry the messages, what mediums we will use, etc., etc. So there is a communication strategy that is being worked out now. It's not yet finalized. We hope to have a lot of it in place within pretty quickly and get it rolling out.
Thank you, Suresh. Professor Samarajiv, I want to bring your attention on the concept of competitive neutrality. I will quickly bring two examples for the benefit of the audience. Now, if you look at the port sector, which I think in the restructuring unit is not focusing. Now, in the port sector, there are private entities also operating, CICT and the SAGT. And Sri Lanka Ports Authority also has a share on both these companies. So they will have a director board representative for represent these two entities, that is CICT, private company, and SAGT, which is also a private company. And the ports operator is also operating the Jaya terminal and some other terminal. So basically, it is like a situation where if I am the Sri Lanka cricket, when I am giving my prep talk, the opposition team member is also in my director board, listening to my board decisions. So in terms of this regulatory versus operating in the business, how do you basically have that framework? How do you have that competitive neutrality framework? Because that, I think, is not being touched, because in the list of institutes, the things like Ports Authority, which is very competitive, is not being considered, I think. How do you plan to address this issue? Again, another example is Sri Lanka Insurance. I think there's a directive for all insurance companies to separate their business to life and general, except Sri Lanka insurance. So basically, even if I'm an investor, whoever an investor, they will consider, why should I go in for an investment where the playing field is not equal? How do you solve this problem?
Dhananath, can I just answer that insurance company thing?
Yes, please.
Yeah,
yes.
So we have told Sri Lanka Insurance to separate out their life and general into 2 separate entities. And they're in the process of doing that, and hopefully that will be done and dusted by end of August.
Thank you, Suresh, for that clarification. Professor Samarajiv, over to you.
Yeah, so I think everybody should know that Suresh's unit, the SRU, has been given a particular mandate which doesn't cover petroleum corporation, doesn't cover ports and so on and so forth, right? So this is outside the framework of what Suresh's unit is doing. We did look at it when I was in the Ministry for Economic Reforms in 2002, 2004. We did look at the situation in the port, and we clearly understood that this was not a good solution. But in fact, it's actually not as, how do I put it? It's not as bad a situation as as it appears. Because all these companies have got partners in various other places, and the port business is a kind of networked business, and they're getting discounts here, there, and everywhere. So while the Port Authority thinks that it is keeping the pricing at the same level for the different terminals, in actual fact, the whole business is being decided by other factors, including discounting, discounts offered in the network level discounts. So no, the ideal model would be a landlord port with a regulator. Landlord port can be, it's just the landlord. It just collects the rents and maybe provides some safety type services which are needed for a port. And then there is a separate economic regulator. Now, India tried something called TAMP, tariff, something for major ports, which was a failure, and they got rid of it, I think. But you can do that. But again, you really have to try to understand the market. And the market is, one market for transshipment, one market for non-transshipment, and you have to think of it in terms of various container ports competing with each other. So you have to have a sophisticated understanding of all that. And within that, you can have a degree of economic regulation. And you can, of course, get rid of these kinds of situations where the regulator is part owner. I mean, given that this is a central bank run event, I would also point out that central bank's ownership of Lanka Clear, which is an entity that it regulates, is a bit of a problem for a regulator to be owning owning shares in operating company. So this is something that we have all over the place in our economy. And we should gradually, depending on our priorities, face these things down in order to achieve the kind of competitive principles that are embodied in Chapter 6 of our Constitution that you began with.
Dhananath, again, if I might add, so from the unit, although like Rohan said, some of these entities don't come under our purview, as a unit, we've made the recommendation that a regulator should not be operating a commercial business. And the principle has been accepted, but of course, now we need to get down to the implementation of it, which is not, which is not going to happen in a week or two.
Thank you. Thank you, Suresh. I think we are into the final few minutes of the conversation. Very quickly, Mr. Manjula, I would like to bring your attention in terms of, you have also been mentioned, I think the panel is broadly in agreement with, there cannot be like a broad brush approach on this restructuring. So if you were to privatize, do you think what the government has selected and prioritized is the right way to do it? I think they have left the network industries quite aside. I think some are restructuring with World Bank and some other programs, the Petroleum Corporation and some others. So do you think this is the right approach, or what's your thoughts on the process?
Yeah, Dhanata, I think they got onto a set of entities which are to some extent easier to manage, so easier to sort of get off the blocks fast. So I think that would have been a factor in selecting some of these entities. There are others which are a little more complicated, and also, like we discussed earlier, privatization is not the solution for all of them, right? So in some cases, actually, you may need to keep the state-owned entity going, but open the market, bring new players in, liberalize the market. So that's what I think is happening on the petroleum distribution side, maybe on the electricity generation side. You can have the same kind of model. So while retaining the government entities under state ownership, but it's very important, I think, coming on to that other point we were discussing of keeping regulation and commercial activity separate. I want to bring in one more element. Policy making should also be separate thing. So there are three pillars actually: policy making, regulation, and commercial operation. Now, right now, in some cases, people are involved in everything, right? You can't have that. So you can't have, say, the petroleum ministry setting policy for the petroleum industry and also operating the CPC. So that then, creates an unlevel playing field when you have other private sector entities also operating in competition with that state entity. You need to separate these three areas. I think then you will have a very clear open field where each one knows exactly what they have to do.
Thank you, Manjula. Coming back to Professor Samarajiva, I will keep the final remarks to Suresh. One question, actually, when I was moderating another panel discussion, when I was panelist on another panel discussion, but another concern came from, in particular, from Mr. Peter de Almeida, representing the trade unions, was that a study was done by Professor Ricardo Hausmann in, I think, 2016-19 period, and they have identified binding constraints for Sri Lanka's economic growth. And this study was published. I'm sure you may have referred, but the state-owned enterprises reforms hasn't been identified as one of the binding constraints. And even if you recall the IMF initial statement on September, the state-owned enterprises haven't been in one of the 7 main listed items. So why, from the opposing camp, one of the main concerns coming out is why state-owned enterprises reforms, if it's not a binding constraint, if it's not highlighted by IMF? What's your justification, Professor Samarajiva?
I think the basic point is we need to fix our country. We are not trying to. I don't even see the IMF agreement. I call it. I mean, it is an agreement. Things that our government has proposed to the IMF, rather than what the IMF has imposed on us. So I think we have to look at what is needed for this country. The issue really is we need a more efficient economy, and the way to get a more efficient economy is to get competition, as Suresh pointed out several times, get competition moving, competitive pressures being placed on all companies, including those that have some form of state ownership, and to move government priorities, to give priorities to what needs to be given priority to. So just to give one example, I believe that there have continually been references to the energy utilities in all the IMF documents. And there we simply say, just make sure you don't have the treasury carrying the losses for these organizations. But how do we minimize those losses? How do we give people energy supplies at the right price, with the right quality, without blackouts and things like that? In order to do that, we need to reform the sector. And without reforming the energy sector, I don't think we are ever going to get back to a decent growth path, which is the way we'll really get out of this problem that we are in. So I think we need to answer those questions in that particular manner, which is our priorities, what we need to do for our economy, rather than what somebody that we have signed an agreement. That's about debt sustainability. The IMF thing is about debt sustainability. It's not about growing the economy, right? So it is in that context that we are doing it. I think in closing, I would really like to pose a question, I think related to the communication aspects, where in an unpaid manner, I seem to be doing quite a lot of the communication on the reform and restructuring process. And some people are saying that I'm doing it for the government. I say, no, I've been doing it for a long time on my own account, for my own purposes, because I just want a country that I can live in. And I want my grandchildren to have a country that they can live in. That's my reasoning. So I would say that, particularly given the levels of cynicism that we have in our society, it would be good to have some what we call the propaganda of the D, communication through action. And if we can take things like Lanka hospitals, which kind of accidentally came into the government pot. I mean, nobody ever thought that the government would be running a sort of private hospital meant for rich people as part of its health policy. It just accidentally fell into the government lap. If we can get some of those things done quickly, I think that would be a wonderful start to the communication campaign, because then people will see the benefits, they'll see the money coming in, they'll see the investments going in, and all these other good things happening. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Samarajiva. Suresh, time is for you for final remarks, but I will make a little bit of fun out of this conversation as well. If I were to ask you a question, imagine I was appointed, it's Dhananath Fernando was appointed to your seat, because people bring a lot of questions on the transparency issue, because I think in the public domain, people are questioning about profit-making enterprises being privatized. That means they are pretty much agreeing on restructuring the loss-making one. So then it's a case of the profit-making one. So, and also people bring the concerns about this transparency issue. So if I was appointed as the chair to do your job, and I follow the same process that you follow, but at the cabinet level, I smell some irregularity or something going, I smell something different, or I smell a corrupt deal. If you were my advisor, what would you advise me to do? With that, I will leave out for you for the final remarks.
So Dhananath, I don't think I'll need to advise you. I'll just offer you my seat and get up and go home and watch Netflix, which is something that I like to do. In terms of final remarks, at the end of the day, let's not look at the SOE restructuring process as selling something. It's fundamentally about making this economy a more competitive economy, and it's about providing citizens of Sri Lanka better quality products and services at better prices and with better availability. I mean, that is the overriding objective of the exercise. And yes, as part of that exercise, there will be certain entities that are unchained from government and passed on to the private sector. We will try to make sure that in that process, government monopolies are not transferred into being private sector monopolies. That's something that we are grappling with at the moment. We also need to understand that there will be certain enterprises, commercial enterprises, that remain within the fold of government, and then we need to have mechanisms to make sure that those enterprises are run commercially, are run profitably, and are run efficiently and effectively, so that they meet the purpose for which they have been set up, which is to give those goods and services to the citizens. And I think we also need to move away from this concept of profit, because government does not need to make profit. Government has a different mechanism to get its funds, to get its resources, which is called the taxation system. It has all the power it needs to collect the resources it needs through that taxation system. So it does not really need to make profit. And, let's really focus on the true national assets of the country, which are some of those things that I highlighted. And let me finally say that none of these enterprises, these commercial enterprises that we are talking about, are the national assets. The national assets are somewhere else. We need to focus on those national assets if we are to build the country that we want. So thank you, Dhananath. I'll stop with that.
Thank you very much, Suresh. Thank you very much, Professor Samarajiva. Thank you very much, Mr. Manjula, for joining the panel. And thank you very much for everyone who sent us the questions. I hope I did the maximum justice by clubbing questions and giving the opportunity to get your questions answered. Thank you very much. Over to you, Kushan.
Thank you very much, Dhananath. And thank you very much, all the panelists. I guess there were more than 40 questions in the chat box and Q&A column. So a very, very interesting job you did to make sure that most of the questions were answered. If we could not, apologies from our end, since we have to limit those in the interest of time. With that, we are about to conclude today's expert panel discussion. So on behalf of Center for Banking Studies of Central Bank of Sri Lanka, let me thank and express our gratitude to Mr. Suresh Shah, Mr. Manjula Silva, and Mr. Professor Rohan Samarajiva and Mr. Dhananath Fernando for the invaluable contribution for this expert panel discussion. And thank you very much for all the viewers who joined with us via Zoom and Facebook, and who ultimately made this event a success. So Center for Banking Studies, CBS, will continue to host these types of events to make sure that the public get through picture, public get some awareness on current economic topics, timely topics. So please stay in touch, follow our Facebook page as well as CBS website, so you will get to know about our upcoming events. With that, thank you very much to all of you once again. We'll meet again soon in a event like this. Thank you very much and have a good evening.